Hello, Igniting Community. I'm Doris Forrester, and I'm back with another Global Population and Gender Talk. For the month of May, my focus was on human trafficking, looking at global patterns, who the victims are, the types of trafficking, and who the perpetrators are, and how do they go about trafficking a person. The focus for June is going to be on what can we do about human trafficking, what is being done, what regions of the world are leaders in dealing with human trafficking, and what parts of the world are falling behind. Do I think human trafficking will ever stop? I don't, because I think there's a lot of people that will continue to be vulnerable and desperate, and unfortunately there's still a lot of people that will take advantage of that desperation and vulnerability. So what I'm hoping is that as countries get on board with trying to prosecute and empower victims and prevent human trafficking, that we see less victims, we see more convictions, and we see less of this crime. So the United Nations does believe that it's important to raise awareness, shed light on trafficking patterns, flows, in order to help governments, parliaments, stakeholders to develop the solutions. And the solutions have to be looking at the causes and preventing it, looking at risk factors and preventing it, prosecuting the offenders, and then looking at the victims, protecting them and helping them recover. It has to be done this way, and the United Nations, I believe, has done a great job at coming up with a protocol that has been adopted by almost every country in the world to deal with this. So the General Assembly adopted the United Nations Convention against transnational organization crime, and there were two protocols that were part of this. I'm only going to focus on the first one, the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. That was adopted in November 15th, 2000, and it was referred to as the Palermo Protocol because it was created in Palermo, Italy. This was created in consultation with 116 countries. We now have 178 that are party to the protocol. The idea was that when the rights of citizens have been compromised, governments must, or they are obliged to restore it. And so the Palermo Protocol operates under a 3P paradigm, which is prevention, prosecution, and protection. And it looks at the victim, and it's a victim-centered approach by ensuring that the rights of individuals are guaranteed. So when we're looking at prevention, it's not just government, it's NGOs, it could be a regular citizen of a country. We want to prevent the violation. We want to prevent human trafficking from ever happening. I think the UN has, and the countries that were involved, realized that that's not likely going to happen, so that when we find that somebody has enslaved a person, the prosecution must be a harsh punishment, and we must convict. And that's where I think we're falling short. And then finally, the protection. Once we get the victims, you can't just leave them. We need to provide mental health supports, medical, physical health supports, and also helping them create a future for themselves. So looking at this map from 2021, these are the countries in green, are the countries party to the protocol. They have signed, they have agreed. The countries in orange have not. They are the Congo, Sudan and South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, Iran, Pakistan, Bhutan, North Korea, and Papua New Guinea. I'm not sure why they haven't signed, but they haven't. So each year, the United Nations produces a report called the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons. This is the most recent report. The 2021 has not been released. That will be released sometime in 2022. So NGOs play a part, and it's a partnership. And if you look at this, the visual at the bottom, it's protection, prevention, prosecution. I've gone through those. But it's also a partnership between governments, within a country, geopolitically between countries, and also the role of organizations, non-governmental organizations. The NGOs can focus on prevention and protection only, but they can encourage or lobby or pressure governments to work on the prosecution, convictions, and penalties. But it's only the governments that can pass those laws, state the penalties, and the policies. So I'm going to go over some NGOs and some things that are being done to increase prevention, raise awareness, and also protection. So July 30th is World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. The United Nations has a site you can go to where they give you prevention signs that you can use at school. But the only problem is it's in the summer, and so many of us are not teaching. But you can be aware of the signs, and I typically go here, and when I'm doing something on human trafficking, I do refer to this, and it's the Blue Heart campaign, and the Blue Heart is becoming a sign of support for victims of human trafficking. I just want to highlight a couple of NGOs. Stop the Traffic is very good. Their focus is on prevention and protection, and you can see I just highlighted what they do. They are raising money, they are encouraging people to get involved, and they are through awareness campaigns, but also through programs to help support victims in their survival and their recovery. Sophie Hayes, I mentioned her in one of my talks. She was a victim of human trafficking and survived, escaped, and now she's dedicated her life to helping others, and she wants to help women live a life without fear to achieve complete sustainable freedom, which I think is wonderful, and you can donate, and there's things about what her foundation does and what to do to take action. One, I just wanted to highlight a company, a retail company. This is The Body Shop, and from 2009 to 2012, they had an awareness campaign. They raised funds, signatures. I think it's here 7 million signatures. The petitions were presented to the heads of state of 40 countries. They've worked within the European Union, United Nations Human Rights Council to raise awareness, and they've raised money also to help support victims. And it was a very effective campaign, I remember it, but they've stopped it. But every so often they change their focus and raise awareness about different environmental and social justice issues, so maybe they will come back to this at some point. And then I went to, this is a site I often go to see about an NGO or a charity, and this is the donor box, and it recommends these 10 NGOs for fighting to combat human trafficking. A lot of these are for prevention, but also protection of victims. And Polaris Project is very active internationally. And then I wanted to just quickly look at some awareness campaigns. This one is from the International Organization for Migration, and it warns women about working abroad and the dangers that they may face. Very strong imagery. This is from the government. It's warning the public, and it's on the border between Thailand and Myanmar. The majority of victims from Thailand are coming from other countries, so it's right at the border. As migrants are coming through from Myanmar, they would see this and hopefully not fall victim to it. And these are just various awareness campaigns from governments. This one's from the Ohio State government. And then there's very different ones with phone numbers and sort of putting faces to victims, but also doing it in such a way that you can place yourself as potentially being a victim. These are very powerful ones. Can you see her? He lied about the job and then took my passport. I was sold for $1,000. What will your cost be? Very effective. And again, they're from either NGOs or governments around the world. And so I want to focus on the United States. They're a very powerful country. We know they're one of the superpowers. They have the highest GDP, or the second highest now, GDP in the world, and they wield a lot of power. And so what they did in response to the Palermo Protocol was to create this Human Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the year 2000. And their mandate was to create an office to monitor and combat trafficking within the State Department. And they also they publish a report every year called Trafficking in Persons. And what they do is that they rank countries, or they place countries in tiers. And they assess what countries are doing to meet the minimum standards that they have set according to those 3 Ps of protection, prosecution, and prevention. Or prevention, prosecution, and protection. So Tier 1 countries are fully in compliance with the minimum standards. Tier 2 are doing a really good job, but they're not quite there yet, but they're on their way. And then the Tier 2 watch list are countries in Tier 2 that are really have stopped, or they're not doing as good of a job as they used to, and they could very easily slip into a Tier 3, or they're countries in Tier 3 that are starting to make some movement towards doing something that could potentially go into Tier 2. Okay, and that goes again with the Tier 2. So they're not providing evidence, or they have very high numbers of victims. And then the Tier 3 are not fully complying with the minimum standards, and they're not really doing anything to do so. And so these are the minimum standards. So they feel that countries should prohibit severe forms of trafficking. They're saying that countries should have laws in place saying that children cannot be making decisions for consent, because a lot of children are victims of trafficking, but also they've got that they're coerced, and it's almost like grooming that happens. And there should be punishments. They also feel severe forms of punishment should have punishments that are stringent, that discourage, and they should make countries should be making sustainable efforts to eliminate severe forms of trafficking. So countries that are in Tier 3, these are potentially what could happen. So they could be subjected to some sanctions. The government could withdraw or withhold foreign assistance, but cannot be trade-related or humanitarian. They could lose funding or not receive funding for any cultural or education exchange for government employees. But the big one is they perhaps cannot, funding from the IMF or World Bank could be held back. And the U.S. is that powerful, and a lot of those organizations the U.S. has control over. So here are the placement of Tier 1 and Tier 2 countries. If you look at the Tier 1, you can see that there's a lot of high-income countries there. And the Philippines is there, and they're sort of a low-middle-income country. But they've recognized the problem, and they've done a really good job. The governments, the NGOs there, there's been a lot of action on human trafficking to reduce it, to identify it, to help victims. Here, the Tier 2 countries, you can see it's a huge range between middle-income and high-income countries. Middle-income and low-income countries. And some high-income countries. Very shocking to see that, Germany or Greece. So it's a whole, it doesn't matter on income level. And then when we look at the Tier 2 watch list, here we tend to see more of the lower-income countries here, and Tier 3. Now, the 3 special cases, Libya, Somalia, and Yemen, there's, they've got political instability, and I think that's where they're in the special case area. And I always like to see a visual. So if you look at the Western Hemisphere, you can see the countries identified in red versus green. Green is Tier 1, red is Tier 3. And then you can look at Africa. Africa, most of the countries are Tier 2 and Tier 2 watch list. Central and South and Central Asia, no Tier 1 countries there. And there's huge problems with human trafficking there. Europe, we have a mix, but there's a division almost between the East and the West of Europe. And then East Asia Pacific, and then you look at the Near East, which is basically Northern Africa and the Middle East. And they've got the special cases, but they also have only one, which is Lebanon, that is a Tier 1 country. So you can see that the issue is pretty well spread out throughout the globe. We have countries from in all regions that are either Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 2 on the watch list, or Tier 3. That is it for me for this segment. I will be back to look at specifically convictions and prosecutions around the world, and looking at what areas are doing a really good job at doing it and what areas need some work. And until then, I'm going to say bye. Have a good one, and let's just try and be kind to one another. Ciao for now.